All right, guys, we're back. And I will tell you, I have had multiple conversations about what's happening with the Homebase program here in Massachusetts. And today, I'm going to bring you up to speed. I want you to know what I know. And I'm going to rip off that Band-Aid and explain pretty much everything I've learned thus far. But before we get into that, I think you really need to understand how we got there and how we are transitioning people to Homebase. And it really started with the collapse of Massachusetts emergency shelter systems. So under Governor Maura Healey, the state originally went from a $3.6 billion surplus under Charlie Baker to a $1 billion shortfall, despite Maura inheriting one of the strongest budget positions in this state's history. The Healey administration, I think, overspent, underperformed, and ultimately resorted to a $375 million emergency cut while simultaneously draining a $625 million from non-tax revenue just to balance the books. So in turn, you're basically scraping the bottom of the barrel there, trying to make ends meet to some extent. And that fiscal desperation led, in my opinion, to a major policy shift, which happened at the beginning of the year, which was the access rights to the emergency assistance shelters. Because what Maura ended up doing was she capped it to both U.S. citizens and some lawfully present immigrants. But this was only after the unchecked spending on the migrant shelter expansion. You figure, the Healey hotels had these crazy contracts in terms of what people were getting paid and probably some poor oversight, which in turn pushed costs completely out of control, completely out of proportion. We were spending $3,000 per week per family in the emergency shelter system. And as I've said before, I'll say it again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this is not going to be sustainable. And since this change, the emergency shelter systems numbers on paper, they are declining. But that's not because they solved the problem, but because the families in the emergency shelters are just being pushed into the Homebase program. And I think a good reflection of what's happening with Homebase is the recent budget increases for this program, or the monies that are being funneled into this program. So now, let's talk a little bit about how we got here, okay? Just as important. Massachusetts is one of the only states with a right to shelter law, but we are buckling under two things. Number one is housing, and number two is the crisis that we have with the budget. Also, you could think, median rents here are like 50% above the national average. Homelessness is up 18% in 2024 per HUD. And you drive around, there's American families that are basically sleeping on the streets here. So, Homebase, which is run by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, this program was originally designed to help eligible families for emergency assistance. So people, you figure, in a crisis, maybe facing eviction, domestic violence, or some level of a disaster, they could stay out of the shelter system and then get into permanent apartment housing through this program. Now, the emergency assistance program, that was originally created in 1983 under Massachusetts right to shelter law, which was meant to support families with children or pregnant women. And while it's not necessarily restricted to citizens of the United States under Massachusetts law, the federal laws like the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act and HUD guidelines effectively limit any benefits that the federal government gives to a state for these programs to U.S. citizens or to qualified immigrants. Okay? If you violate these rules, which I think perhaps might have happened, that could result in millions of dollars in federal money having to get paid back to some extent. And obviously, the federal government could revoke certain grants. You get the point. So both HUD or the DOJ could, and I think should, investigate this. And they should require more thorough verification. That's what should happen here. Because there could potentially be lawsuits from citizens, U.S. citizens, that were potentially denied benefits if and only if illegal immigrants are allegedly prioritized. This is a big deal, guys, because this could also pertain to Fair Housing Acts and a violation of that. I think the major reason why you saw Healy make the changes that she made to the program in the first place, as I ironed out earlier, was because of this problem. That's what I think, on top of the spending. So moving forward, if you qualified for emergency assistance, you could also simultaneously qualify for Homebase. You could get $30,000 through Homebase for permanent housing over 2 years. And if you need it for a third year, you get an additional $15,000, ballooning the program to $45,000 per family over those 3 years, which covers rent, moving costs, and those costs and expenses are paid directly to the landlords. Now, here's where it gets absolutely infuriating and the incentives come into play. So in Massachusetts, it's unlawful for landlords to collect more than 2 months of rent plus a security deposit from tenants. However, under the Homebase program, the program itself seems to be allowed to pay a 1 month rent bonus, which is paid directly by the state through the program or through an ancillary program, which effectively creates a loophole that incentivizes landlords to receive an additional payment or an additional fund without violating the cap, as it's not considered a tenant-paid amount. It's absolutely remarkable how they could just skirt around these things and these issues and these laws. It's really remarkable. But here's the deal. Under the new rules that Healy laid out for the emergency shelters, what I believe is happening is illegal immigrants are now required to leave the emergency assistance shelters by the end of this year, which is 2025. And as a direct result, U.S. citizens and or immigrants who can qualify will re-enter those shelters that were originally probably on some crazy wait list. Now, let's consider the money. Recently, there was a push to supercharge the Homebase program, with Senator Liz Miranda sponsoring legislative action aimed to strengthen the Homebase program under the amendment number 435 and the Senate amendment under 323, if you want to look them up. And what that did was they were proposing an increase in the benefits to $50,000 in the first 2 years and $25,000 for the third. So the difference is going from $45,000 to $75,000. It's almost a third more. Now, those reforms, they didn't pass yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do. And remember, these families get full access to benefits like SNAP, Mass Health, and obviously this Homebase program as well. But here's where it gets murky. And that comes down to the employment. Because if you have an entire family who is working and, let's say, is paid beyond the income threshold for these programs, whether they're on or off the books, they technically should not qualify for Homebase. Now, I can tell you that this is happening, but I'm not sure if this is happening at scale or the people that I've spoken to, if these were just isolated incidents. But it needs to have more of a spotlight on this because people who otherwise shouldn't qualify are, meaning that people are working. Homebase is asking for verification, but they don't necessarily get a verification of employment form or anything like that. They simply ask the question. If the person that's applying for Homebase says, no, we're not working, they don't check any further from that. That's it. So you could have a working family that's getting free rent. That's basically what it boils down to. Furthermore, if the landlords, as I said earlier, are allegedly being incentivized to take illegal immigrants over U.S. citizens, it's a huge problem, and one I will be sending, along with this video, over to the DOJ. Because if this continues to happen, and it's truly happening at scale, I would think that lawsuits are potentially inevitable, and it's going to get exposed. So let's talk about the bigger picture here for a minute, which I think is, I would say, pretty bleak. Healy declared a state of emergency in 2023 when the shelters were maxed out at around 7,500 families, right? So the state is already spending $1 billion plus annually on shelters, with probably another $1 billion projected for the next year. If Homebase placements collapse when the subsidies end, or the federal government gets involved, or landlords are kicking tenants out, we're just delaying the crisis that we also created. And we're not solving anything. We're not solving anything. Moreover, if the state is allegedly bribing landlords to house illegal immigrants and incentivizing landlords by creating a loophole so they could get paid more money, I think there's a huge, huge liability problem here. So, Homebase, I wouldn't say is not necessarily a scam, because it does help families in need. But the execution of this very messy and controversial program, that's the problem. And there are serious legal and or ethical questions that need to be answered, especially if citizens are being pushed aside. I'm not saying that's the case, but I am saying that if you incentivize a landlord to take application A, and that incentivization is by money, and somebody else doesn't have that same opportunity to incentivize said landlord, there is, in my opinion, a clear fair housing violation here. And nobody, absolutely nobody, is talking about this. Furthermore, what ends up happening, and I'm not trying to, not have people find shelter or anything of that nature, but what I am trying to find out is if what's fair for one person or one family is fair for another. That is the problem. And in my opinion, the fastest way to radicalize people is to have unfair treatment on one side and fairer treatment on the other. It is a huge, huge problem. And I will say it again, I've probably said it 3 times, okay? Based on who I talk to, these are isolated incidents. Did they happen, and are they happening repeatedly, is up for debate. The more people that contact me on these issues, the more ammunition I will have to bring to you. But irregardless of all of that, it's still, if it's an isolated incident, it is still one isolated potential fair housing violation here. You see where I'm going with this? It's a huge problem. So that's all I have for now with the Homebase program. As I get more information, and if you work for Homebase, or you used to work for Homebase, or you're a contractor that's working with Homebase, please do the right thing. Please contact me, because who you are hurting, or who the state is potentially hurting, are the U.S. citizens of this state. And if the federal government is truly giving grant money or money to a state, and that money is going to the emergency shelter systems, which in turn should be used for U.S. citizens because the money is coming from the federal government, that's a massive issue. And there is more liability there. So I'm going to contact Leah Foley when I'm done with this video, and when this video is uploaded, and send it to her and see what she has to say about it. Because I think it deserves investigation, because there is a mega amount of money that is involved with this. And this is only what we know. This is only what we know. I think that what we don't know could potentially be even worse. So that's it for today's video, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.